looks like it's going to be recording this. So it worked. It did work last time. Okay. Yeah, that's fine, Raul. I just want to make sure you can get caught up with stuff. So I just want to make sure you see what assignments we had last week. Anyway, saw your chat there. Okay, so this quote, let's see. Yeah, I mean, we were talking about this last week, introducing ideas of scale and how ecology really tries to understand, well, especially landscape ecology. It's like thinking about an ecologist who's dealing with biology, but also the geography, like a geographer thinking about large scale land issues. But as we start thinking about scale, both in terms of space and time, and how we're trying to see these different natural processes happen, or the results of them, or how the change occurs, how they evolve. Same's true with our interventions, with our architecture. This is part of the built, and it's part of the whole human ecosystem. But understanding the scale at which we have to think about and design for, I think often we're not, there's a lot of room to think at larger and larger organizational scales, both in time and space. So today we're going to just review what we discussed last week in terms of scale and some of the catalysts around the shift towards larger scale landscape ecology thinking, introduce some of the ideas around about landscape performance, and continue with that in your lab as well. And then, talk more about the landscape pattern stuff. This is really the Foreman book. Yeah, but again, it's not just him. This idea of the patterning with the patch corridor matrix, that in the landscape mosaic, making it the landscape mosaic. Those are things that the science has developed. Foreman just happens to be the one that really does make a jump from the sciences to the design realm. He's writing at Harvard over there. You guys are getting his readings, and these books are definitely worth checking out. The Lands Mosaics and Urban Ecology, Science of Cities. So with that, let's keep going. Who remembers?
Can you describe a little bit what the landscape mosaic is?
Say that again. Landscape.
Can you go to the previous slide?
Yeah.
Mosaic? I don't know how to pronounce it.
Mosaic? Yeah,
yes.
Mosaic landscape pattern. That's just, so that's the way to describe the overall pattern. The mosaic pattern is that heterogeneous, uneven pattern that you guys have been describing. It's literally just, whatever pattern you see on the land. And using the word mosaic is just a way to describe that unevenness, or that heterogeneous unevenness. So those words are all kind of interchangeable. Like it's describing, again, just that this thing is a pattern. Another way to think about it, on a lot of studios, a lot of kind of conceptual studios thinking about landscape, especially landscape systems, like weaving. And when you imagine different things pulling the warp and the weft into not an even grain but an uneven grain. So yeah, one of the discussion questions from last week, the idea of what's another way to describe mosaic pattern, and it's literally the heterogeneity is literally the same thing. And what landscape what land mosaics and what Foreman does with this way of breaking down the mosaic pattern into a patch corridor and then the underlying matrix system, it just helps articulate the forms, because we're saying that these ecological processes have certain spatial results, and the results actually change depending on the space, depending on the abiotic and biotic and factors of the space. All right, so there's the relationship both between the form and the processes, and that's what how do you articulate that, and how do you start to look at it? And those are the words they started to use to describe them. What ends up happening though is you might describe a patch at multiple scales. You could describe a patch at the detailed scale or a very far removed scale, but you have to describe it. What is it? What your patch of what depends on the scale you're looking at. So it's you have to articulate it in the legend, or in terms of what you're trying to, the pattern that you're observing. I think hopefully it'll make more sense as we apply it. Literally, we are going to be trying to describe the patches and corridors. So, for example, on this image, you might talk about patches of this one species of oak. It's a gambrel oak. they grow by it's like the orange color and the darker color. They grow by coppicing, meaning that their roots just kind of pop out right next to each other. Someone talking about bamboo, I've mentioned that there are two types. There's running, and this other is basically like coppicing. They just form a certain size versus their roots shooting out and starting to grow somewhere else. But literally what you see here is a mosaic pattern, a mosaic landscape pattern of different plant species. One is this gambrel oak. They're forming these patches. And then the larger matrix would be what this overall kind of landscape is, which is, say, it's probably some kind of temperate alpine forest. I'm just guessing. I don't know exactly. And the corridor it looks like it's in a valley, actually. And this would be like a ridge corridor and a valley corridor. Or you could talk about a smaller scale corridor between these patches of gambrel oak, smaller corridors of whatever that white plant is.
Sorry, quick question. In this photo, are those are we looking at the tree canopy? Or are these just is this ground cover?
Yeah, they're kind of medium-sized tree. Yeah, they're like a medium-sized tree. It's a small oak, the gambrel oak. You're right, though. The scale does totally get odd in this image. I agree. But yeah, it's probably like a 15-foot patches of 15 to 20 foot trees. So they're not huge. Okay. Yeah. Maybe they could be even as much as, I'd say 20. Like this over here on the right, that might be 25 to 30. This group is getting taller. They're probably just different age stands, different age of different ages of the same tree. And the different coloring could just even be ground conditions, soil conditions, actually. Okay, so just a little more on this, the term landscape ecology and this idea that really what we're emphasizing is the interaction between pattern and space and ecological processes, natural processes in the biotic and abiotic world. So it's this interaction between spatial patterns and ecological processes that those are the causes and consequences of the unevenness. Okay, so again, those are the mechanisms that cause this spatial heterogeneity, right? Let's see. This is just the word landscape ecology was introduced in about 1940 by this geographer, and in describing this idea that it's essentially the combined spatial approach of the geographer with the functional approach of the ecologist, which I think starts to really, for me, it starts to make more sense. Like, what are we talking about? We're talking landscape ecology. But again, we talked last week, there are these three catalysts that shifted to this larger scale this shifting to this larger scale. And one is just that the issues that we're trying to understand with environmental change are really large and have to do with large scale land management issues and, large industrial processes and urban development things. So they're really broad scale. We have pollution from one side of the country causing acid rain on the other side. They're not, we need to be thinking globally to address environmental issues. There's no doubt. And then one of the second issues was just in science, the shifting around the discussion, starting to understand that some of the organism responses and behaviors had to do with space. It had to do with their context. It had to do with other interactions that were happening at a larger scale. It wasn't just in the biology of the animal, of the organism. Surprise, surprise, our environment matters, right? But, a lot of it is that, trying to find stable states amongst populations, that you need to start seeing larger ranges of spatial conditions in order to see the stable states among a single species. And that, trying to understand how those stable configurations work amongst different populations, requiring different spatial, with different species requirements in terms of space. We talked last week about how scale can be species specific, where it's how far they have to go when they're eating versus how far they go when it's a dispersal situation, when they have babies, and that way they'd go far enough away so they wouldn't be sharing another, fighting for the same food. That's not going to be true necessarily with every species, but you'll see that pattern often. So then the third catalyst was really their technological advances. We can do things now with data in terms of the rate of processing and collection, just that are, absolutely unfathomable to someone even 10, 15, 20 years ago. So things have really changed. But this, the basic separation of biotic and abiotic is pretty straightforward. Biotic is anything with stuff with carbon, is all the living organisms, people, animals, and plants. Abiotic is everything else, all the climate, all of the minerals, all of the elements that form everything else. It's not talking about the life that is within those elements, but just the elements and climate. So and then once you've gotten those clear, this diagram is, we have the biotic and physical or abiotic as the original kind of approach to ecosystem thinking, but now with the human ecosystem concept that you're reading from last week, I think should have discussed, there is really this addition of the built and the social to just the abiotic and the biotic. So, every architecture we build, every road we've laid, every piece of infrastructure, every social contract we've made, every capitalism, socialism, all of them, every government organization, it's all part of what we have built and made on this planet and the ecosystem of what the humans experience. It's a very different way to think about nature, right? For me, really exciting. I find it exciting. And as a designer, I find it extremely exciting. But so we talked again, what does that mean? It means basically you're addressing kind of everything with design on some level, at some scale, in some way, depending, its role obviously varies. But we talked about you being able to separate on this list which are abiotic and which are biotic. Can someone do that for me again? Which are the abiotic and which are the biotic categories here?
Human, wildlife, are biotic.
Right. Human, wildlife, and vegetation are biotic. Yeah. Exactly.
And then soil is a mix.
No,
right?
Yeah. So we were talking about this last week too. Like that should say dirt if you're a landscape architect, because soil implies something really precious, right? All those living organisms, and it is very complex. And exactly what we were just talking about earlier with Drawdown, the ideas around restorative agriculture and using food waste and compost. I mean, soil is actually probably one of the most exciting things we've got going on. But here the implication is dirt. It's literally just the minerals. It's not talking about all that life. So good point. And we also talked last week that in human we would potentially break that down into these two categories of social built if we were trying to make this align with that Pickett diagram. But again, I think it's, the important part is not exactly the word, it's the concepts. I think you guys are getting that. So, and again, in terms of opportunities for design within this kind of scaled ecological thinking, there's so many places to engage. It's again, this is not an exhaustive list by any means on the right. It's just like if you're going to put any of those topics first, you can address a lot of different areas of research within the fields of design. So and there are many more than are even included here, but a lot of you were mentioning in your introductions too, interests in novel ecosystems, actually. So a novel ecosystem, the implication is you might use an ecology, like a natural ecology, a plant cleans something up a certain way, but you might push it, or you might amplify its behavior in order to solve a particular issue. So some of that is, it's like they're functioning like natural systems, but they're human made and they are human formed. So, it can, any, like a water retention basin can look like anything. It has to function in certain ways, but it can be most different shapes. It doesn't have to look like many of them do. So there's a lot of opportunity, and a lot of you expressed interest in kind of, I guess, actually like detailed studies around plant biomes or terrariums and things, and to me that lends itself towards being able to really design novel ecosystems and use plants to the extent that they're capable. Another way to think about it too would be even just pushing the abilities of plants with actually hybridization and whatnot. So I guess I wanted to share a project at a variety of scales and like how one might, how the different scales end up addressing. I mean, you can address different topics for a single project site, and this isn't this is just to anyway. So the project site, this fresh pond, is in this area of Cambridge that was historically a great swamp. Yeah, so we have, let's see, in this image, you can see the fresh pond is here, this little blue piece. You guys can see my arrow, correct? Yeah. In the bottom left there, it's quite small, and above that it says the Great Swamp, and it's kind of a shaded area. That Great Swamp is here. It's all this land now. So the whole site is it's a Alewife Brook over in Cambridge, and historically all flooded. It definitely is one of the first to flood now. So, and it's actually, let's see, I think it's just, it's in this portion of this watershed. Alewife Brook comes into the larger, I'm blocking the name of this river at the moment, but again, I mean, I'm mentioning for some of you who were talking a lot about coastal wetlands and things, one of the issues here in Boston is so we'll have coastal flooding and surge, along the waterfront and all this issues up in here in Boston. But what you can see on this watershed plan is that there's a huge amount of drainage area that depends on being able to outlet through there. So that flooding not only affects that, it actually ends up with like a big rainstorms and things. It also affects everything behind. So this is a site that will absolutely be experiencing flooding when we have some of those backed up waterfront coastal conditions. And there's been a lot of effort to switch from a combined storm sewage system to this. What you see in this drawing on the right is the engineers' drawings for how they're going to be separating the sewage from the storm, human sewage from storm water sewage. And that's something probably most cities in the world still need to do. Many still in the United States are not necessarily separated, but most are tried or have mostly completed it, that kind of task. But what it means is that normally your sewage is going to the sewage treatment plant and your stormwater is going through the stormwater system, and it comes out through big culverts into like Alewife Brook or the Charles River or the Neponset River or any water body you see in any urban area. But when there's a huge storm, there's too much flow, sewage and stormwater, they both come out in that same system. That's not a good scenario. You can imagine why. And historically that's happened all over the place. So in the sediment and things, there's stuff built up, like lots of nitrogen, a lot of stuff built up from historic dumping as well. Not only the combined storm sewage, but even some point source pollution issues as well with different industries. So
why is it that water wants to flow the same path all the time? Like, my city is built on top of rivers, so every time it rains, we have like accidents, and then the water just wants to keep flowing through its original path. So why is that? Is that because of the location or the earthworks, the geography, and all of that? Because they've tried to make it go a different path, like outside the city, and it doesn't work. Water always wants to follow its own path.
It definitely depends on the larger geography of the area, and I think some will be not solvable. Like you wouldn't even say. So, for example, in Bangladesh, in Dhaka, if you try to stop the water from coming through the city, you have a situation where the river keeps getting higher because every time the river comes down, it drops silt and it makes ground actually. So the river's getting higher and higher, and the embankment's getting higher, and the city's like down here, and you get the river getting higher and higher. So I mean, I don't think that this, the idea of living with the water and like letting it flow through somehow are much better strategies. Sometimes you maybe can make the water force it around, but not necessarily. So here you have an example of it just filling. It's just going to fill like a bucket because it's not going to be able to get out. And so the whole watershed is like, imagine it kind of like a bowl that's like tilted towards the bay. It's just going to fill up because that's going to all be stopped. And this is going to be rain and coming down and draining down, and it'll just start filling up. It's a strange, the backfilling part is a bit unexpected, I think. It's definitely not, there'd be a lot more people affected than maybe they're like, oh, climate change, like all those poor people on the coast. It's not just the people on the coast. All watersheds will be affected. There's no doubt in big storm events, particularly. But literally, it's a movement of gravity. So water's just moving on gravity. We will talk about watersheds a little bit more, and so looking at a grading plan, literally how water does, it's always moving perpendicular to the slope. It's exactly what it does. So you can change it, but you have to be able to change the grading enough to make it move somewhere else.
Yeah.
Shouldn't like rainwater be clean? Because like if it's all in the city, like where is it, there like oil and dirt and I don't know whatever they throw on the ground during winter, this white thing.
I mean, good point. It should all be cleaned, not just stormwater should be cleaned. I don't think at this point Boston is like doing anything with its stormwater. They're still trying to get the sewage out. And that's true with most cities, I think. But absolutely, like every outflow could basically be a wetland treatment. I mean, potentially. The whole thing could be more systematically treated with wetlands through the whole system to deal with all the non-point source runoff. Absolutely. Yeah. But we'll talk more about water specifically within the watershed and some of those issues. This is more just to introduce, more about the idea of the different scales that you start addressing things. And then, again, we have this watershed issue, and there were a couple groups looking at it at that scale. I was working with the Urban Land Institute team, and that's a professional, you pay to be part of this group and do this work for free. Really odd. But and we were looking at this area. There were groups looking at all over different parts of Boston, and there were a bunch of different volunteers, architecture firms, and then this was from the city of Cambridge. The scale they're doing like infrastructure scale. This is just historic swamp map. But then this was a more recent site specific project by what is it? The bioengineering group, I believe, were the landscape architects for this. And so this is one of the specific outflows that has been added to the, let's see where it is exactly on here. I don't recall now, actually. I think it might be on the side. I can't remember exactly the site, but it's, a site within this project. I think it's here, actually. There it is. That is it. So it is one of the outfalls, and they did just what you were saying. They built a wetland to treat the runoff, and it was, they tried to make it. They didn't have great design. No, I'm just kidding. I mean, again, it could look like anything. I think they tried to make it look natural, kind of, right? Which is fine. But you could actually make it really obvious that it was human-made and that we were trying to address human mess. But whatever. There's, a lot of strategy about it. But it's a great project in that they really, did what exactly we're talking about. It's 3-part. It looks like they did it. Yeah, 3-part water. Yeah, the forebay. And so when you see when you see a diagram of what a stormwater wetland treatment system might look like, often it's broken into 3 parts, and each pool has a certain job, and there's some washing and stuff that happens in between, which is exactly what this is. It's just not just a diagram; it's actually a design. And I think too often you don't get past the diagram, and it gets built. I mean, engineers will be happy to build the diagram. They just want to keep people safe. We're the ones who have to come in with the spatial suggestions and what we're talking about here, thoughts about where this will go. How is this patch going to evolve? How are the way these plants are planted? How is that going to what's the successional stages going to look like? What's going to come in next? How is it going to look in 10, 15, 30 years? I mean, and to whatever degree you decide, you can push that or and amplify certain things and manipulate that. I mean, there's opportunities with soil deposition, with plant growth, all kinds of things are changing in this landscape, right, over time. Like so many things are changing here, and you can push some of those changes, slow them down, So, when it gets, I think, just more exciting the more you think of the real work that this has to do and the opportunity within forming its spatial implications.
Maybe that's a weird question, but all these plants, are there some kind of special plants which will
I think they probably
more
are.
water?
Yeah, they're gonna. Well, let's see. I'm sure there is a breakdown of the specific plants. Like some will be specific for the particular. I'm just trying to see in the legend there what if it says specifically what is in the planting plan, and it's probably actually a separate
But like if I have a swamp
separate
on my
document. But there's
property-
definitely certain types of plants you'd want to use for,
Uh-huh.
and it'd be local. They'd be local, and they probably not. I mean, you maybe could bring some things else, other things in as well. But it would depend a little bit on the soil but particular contaminants you're trying to address.
So
And
can you
a lot
plant
of
something
like
that-
phytotechnologies are the plants, but a lot of remediation is microbial. It's in the soil and it's microbial. It's biotic mats and just you could think it's a compost tea. It's an injected something liquid. It's not and some of it is at that scale where you're actually breaking down contaminants so they're not an issue. A lot of phytotechnologies, a lot of the plants, it's taking it up, like with heavy metals and things, it's taking it up into its body and you actually have to harvest and deal. So there's, it's different, specifically different strategies depending on what's exactly there. And I think that's really important for all of you to be aware of. I can't tell you how many times I've seen, new hire work and they're like, oh, it treats the water. And I'm like, does it really? I get the idea that it would, and I understand that desire stuff, but like you missed a humongous design opportunity if you didn't figure out what it's really treating and how, and like, what that could be and how you might explain to people what it is. Because even just what you're saying, like, wouldn't it be cool if this was more somehow just in the spatial design, you could understand how it was working? I think that would be awesome. I mean, but yeah, that's a challenge. How do you expose the processes here? That's really, I think, extremely challenging. And I'm asking myself that question all the time. I'll be asking all of you that. So lots of time.
There's one of these.
There's probably even
like
some more
wetland
details about the
filtration
plants if you
systems.
guys want on this project. I know folks have used this at the school. So go ahead. What are you saying? Is that what you're saying, Alec?
No, I was just going to say that there's one of these along the bike trail near my house. It's probably about 10 years old at this point, and it needs some reconstruction. Some of the barriers have sort of washed out, and it's basically like one big pool at this point. We've had a lot of heavy rain this summer. But they, I think there's only so much that you can show just through the design itself. What helps, at least the one near my house, is they have signs and diagrams explaining it by the side of the trail there.
I know. So I have crazy ideas about open science hardware and how to, like the stuff you do measurements of landscape performance with, and how you would integrate this digital stuff with landscapes, and then it's out there. And I agree. Like, it's how do you show what's happening other than like kind of plaques and like descriptions? I'm not sure. But again, I think for me, what I would like to be able to communicate is less necessarily all that process, but something kind of more like people really connect and understand to what's happening. Yeah. But I don't know. Fun to think about. I think when you see one like that that's been damaged too, like what if you took the damage and said, okay, that's the opportunity, and like pushed what it's doing, maybe made it more about eroded landforms or something. It could be cool. Yeah, just more dynamic, but yeah, you mentioned around you're in Arlington, right? Is that right? I'm gonna have to, and that there's a lot along the river. I'd be really interested to see more. I think, didn't they, no, I guess that was in Georgia. I was hearing about a big Greenbelt project that's newer, but yeah, I mean, also there's AMD and art is in somewhere near you in Virginia. The acid mine drainage and art. A project I had heard about way back is Julie Bargman with Dirt Studios, and I guess it's a nonprofit organization. I'm not sure. AMD and art maybe is the name of the nonprofit. But they, at one of the mines where there's acid mine drainage, they use a series of pools with limestone. It's a basically, buffers the acid out of the acid water. It's a cool project, though, partly because of the relationship with local folks. They got a lot of support from like firemen and police officers or something like that, if I remember correctly. A bunch of guys who wanted to have a baseball league, and they redid a baseball field and this cleaning thing, and so they ended up with a lot of support. It was an interesting way to address remediation, which no one wants to take responsibility for, but in the public context, it gets pretty hard. I mean, literally, with all of the Superfund laws, people who own it, the new owners are responsible. It's not quite fair, I'd say. You can have some really hardcore polluters just get off for nothing, have, no responsibility. And that's, again, a capitalism or whatever. There's some issues there about accountability for sure. So this is directly from your Turner chapter 1. Did you guys, hopefully you saw this. You'll read more closely if you haven't yet. But this is, the book, I think, goes through and describes each one of these. So you see the idea being that depending on the topic you might be concerned with, you can address it at a different scale. And that would be, you see a spatial pattern at different kinds of spatial patterns at different scales. So in the first one there on the left, the pattern of the grass is like, what is the cricket habitat you've got going on? Imagine trying to navigate that as a small bug. You might feel about that like the bottom picture in the Gambrel Oak, but in the bottom right is I think a series of wetlands it's a really high aerial view of a series of wetlands in Alaska. And then the upper right is a series of test plots looking at, I think they probably, did a computer model about those patterns and looking about connectivity and looking at how the connectivity, the spatial configuration affects, I think the book said arthropod populations, so grasshopper populations or something. So literally they're trying to understand, will those, certain population of bugs, is it going to affect them differently, having these different spatial patterns of grasses and stuff. Kind of interesting. You could do a similar study with just plants, offering them, same plant, different kinds of space opportunities, say, or different nutrients or different access to light. So many things. You could take one and put some variations on spatial conditions or abiotic conditions and see impact, right? And so did anybody have any comments from the reading about this? Any of these issues? You can even look now if you want. Do you remember this part? We talked about this a bit already. That we're getting into much larger contexts to address these issues. Landscape ecology does. In the upper left there, it's like what you might see from a standing view. Someone standing in a landscape, that's what you see. So that might actually be the extent of a study that you're trying to understand. In the upper right, you can start to see a river corridor amongst a bunch of agricultural land. So, and then bottom left, obviously subdivision development, and bottom right, forestry patterns are trying to do something more mimetic of natural disturbance.
Eyebird view, basically.
Say that again.
So this broader spatial extent would be kind of like eyebird view. Like on Google Maps, you go and you see the eyebird view, and it's kind of like a perspective from the top.
Yes, absolutely. Getting the bird's eye perspective idea. That's like kind of the upper left. But even just, it's and that even that those, in order, like the study might actually be at that scale. Up at a larger regional scale, whereas historically in ecology you would be like studying, one tiny little site and just the soil chemistry at that one location and the population of the bug within your 15-foot block or whatever. Mm-hmm. It historically had just been much smaller. So it's broader spatial extents exactly is what you see when you're like up from a bird's eye perspective, and it's just saying that using that as a study area, using that as understanding your context of a phenomenon.
there's just so many different factors that, like say you take a square foot, there could be, let's say there's like 100 different factors, and we look at 10 that are critical. Some of those factors could span maybe 10 feet, other factors could span miles. Mm-hmm. And it's just like so many webs, and I'm guessing that's what you're talking about.
Exactly. Yeah. And then, I mean, and what happens with this, like, especially things like issues like biodiversity, you try to talk about it, it changes with the scale that you study it. So you try to talk about biodiversity looking at like a small 1 foot square, you're not going to get nothing like you get when you start looking at like a square mile or whatever. And so they just, how does that work when you're trying to set up an experiment, you know, or to prove anything? So that's exactly it. It's kind of like
does it matter if it's diversity evenly spread within a mile radius, or does it matter if it's just this amount of diversity, but it could be within like a quarter mile of that mile radius? Like, does it matter if it's spread out throughout the whole thing or just that one area?
Well, so, yeah, I mean, I think what they end up finding is that the results just get they're totally different. Like, there's no correlation, like, between the different scales. If an understanding of biodiversity, it just literally looks like it just changes at every scale because your results are so different. So, I mean, there's some issues that are exactly what you said. They're so integrated across scales that they're really hard to isolate. And it's a topic of ongoing, like, debate for ecologists who are like, you know, they're trying to write papers around different topics and around biodiversity and things. It's interesting, and it's good to start to understand that that's what their problem is, right? Like, okay, they're trying to understand how they can prove something at a variety of scales. That's exactly it.
We're trying to create mental models to understand what's going on.
Exactly.
Of something that's far more complex than our brains can actually like.
Exactly. And interrelated. Yeah. Yeah, they're trying to isolate, there's so many factors, and they're trying to isolate single factors and be able to study and articulate them. It's extremely challenging. I mean, obviously with design we can do that because it's kind of more about a communicating an idea. That's different than trying to address every single thing involved or something, which, you know, usually ecologists aren't either. They're trying to focus on one issue, and it's hard to isolate, I think, is largely the point, the challenge.
And by focusing on one issue, someone studying a different issue, like you were saying earlier, it could be two different answers. Mm-hmm. But it's not until you step back and compare the larger picture that you can see how they're both correct.
Yeah.
What the actual connection is.
Yeah, exactly. And I think they're starting to find those overlaps and the growth that happens for them within the study, within the discipline. You can definitely find topics,
discussions
like in science. Science magazines are a good place to read on kind of like kind of normal language way. Read about some of the topics, like there are like ecology magazine and things, and conservation magazines. A lot of those are good for trying to understand how scientists are addressing some of the scale issues that come up. But I think and obviously humans is a huge one because of the scale of human impact, like we were talking about in terms of food, and I mean any of the things we do in our daily lives. The scale of the systems required to support that are insane. The patterns that we're making are, the scale of them is just, it's like you should try to imagine just even in your day or on your body where stuff has come from. It's overwhelming. You think about the range and extent of impact we have. But I think this is a shocking diagram of just old growth forests and forest cover from 1620, before we had Europeans coming over here and cutting down all the trees till now, or to the 1900s. It's such a dramatic change. I've read a couple books now too about what this was like historically, and I can't even imagine what these landscapes were like before all those really huge trees were cut down. But so again, you'll see all those images right in the Turner reading. So just kind of skim and then read those parts a little bit more and try to use that to help articulate. Discussion questions. We might need a break for discussion questions. Go ahead. Yeah.
Can you go back to the other map?
Yeah, this one or
yeah, this one. No, this one. Yeah. So for my studio, no, not this one.
The people one,
the US map. This one. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So for my studio, I did a little research about like what did this area look during the 1600s, like pre-colonization.
Mm-hmm.
And I did a little study about like Native Americans and the relationship to nature, right?
Mm-hmm.
Were they more, how can I say this? Like they were more integrated to the ecosystem than we are, right? Like
Native Americans?
Yeah. Like how would you describe their role in the ecosystem back then?
Well, I mean, yeah, well, so I guess kind of the back then thing is probably where sometimes if we look at traditional methods of land management, we get in a problem because we can't go back. And so then I think it's too easy to dismiss. But I think there's something really significant that is missing in particularly Western culture, and that's this idea of reciprocity. That we don't just take from nature; you have to give back in order for it to work. That's in Eastern philosophy. It's in a lot of Eastern religions and thinking. It's in Native thinking. It's not in like Christianity and Western thought. And I think it's actually something that's caused, like, kind of from a really fundamental level, a lot of what we see now. It's just a lack of understanding of we're totally connected to everything nature. Humans aren't separate, and so that reciprocal reality is it's just a way of living and a way of perceiving that would change a lot of behavior if we all held that, but we don't.
I feel like
so
we are connected because we depend on it.
Yeah,
but I feel like a relationship with the rest of the ecosystems, like it's very distant. Like we're very distant. Like we consider ourselves as not part of nature anymore. And I'm just wondering, like, if we reworked on that relationship as a society, like maybe things could improve.
Yeah, I think so. I think it has to be a societal shift. Yeah.
I've been thinking about that for so long, and I think about it all the time. And I feel like a lot of it has to do with how we spend our time. When we don't spend our time in nature, it's easy to forget about it, and it's hard to really have that picture, familiarity. And on top of that, there's so many concepts, and some of them are pretty challenging to understand. And it's hard to connect that somehow.
Absolutely.
I think I saw a study or some survey that showed on average Americans spend 90% of their waking hours indoors. Which is wild to think that, we're spending the vast majority of our time in places that we construct, in our own environments. And, we're really like living in our own world in that sense, and not living in the real world, quote unquote.
It has its own sort of virtual aspect, actually. Even though it's like supposed to be real, it actually sort of fake, because it's like, oh, it's just this wall. No, it's like actually everything that came into making this space be here. If you think of it that way, if you think of reciprocal reality, right? But I agree. We don't perceive it that way. It's it says finite, hard, finished, stable, staying. It's actually not. It's all deteriorating. It's all decaying. It's all turning into dust around you. But,
it's almost like we're in a play and everything's like the scenario is built for us. But it's not real,
It's like a Hitchcock movie or something. Oh, it does have. Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, I think Savina, I think it was you was talking about just how nature peace you feel it in balance you feel in nature, and I think you're right, Christopher. It's time, and I like that. We're not spending enough time outside, and it's not just even. So most of you are all expressing such a. I mean, I'm just like, oh wow, these are like my people. Feel so similar in terms of your connection with nature. So many of you do, and but that's not everybody. I mean, some people have never had that opportunity to have that experience, even yet in their life. So that's another issue. It's like, And as landscape designers and as space designers, we are doing that. So even if it's constructed, how can we still communicate in this constructed world? Because I would say, like Alex saying, all this built thing, but also everything outside, we've affected, like this map shows, we've affected basically everything. Humans, our role has affected every landscape pattern and process on the planet at this point. We've changed the level of carbon or of CO2, carbon, yes, also, but CO2. So just that change in the air quality. There's less oxygen in the air now than there ever has been, and so all those are like just fundamental changes that are going to change everything. So yeah, I think there's no reason we can't still get the message across. It might be in a really different way than we've thought of or seen yet, and I think that's the thing. I think it's something it's not exactly going back, and it's not just pretending like none of that matters, and it's it's somehow closing the loop on a lot of scenarios, and it's at a lot of scales. But
kind of like how you mentioned bringing some kind of interactive thing into landscapes or parks. I think you mentioned. I'm thinking something that we can use is convenient outdoor space. Because a lot of people might want to be out in nature, but they're like, it's really far away, it's a big time-consuming thing. But if we have like community trails and things that are accessible, without having to drive and park and all this other stuff, it might help us. And on those trails, in those areas, if we have some type of interactive thing, or it's just a poster with a picture showing this is what this landscape does, how it connects to everything else.
Absolutely.
Might. I don't know if people want to look at it.
Yeah.
Maybe.
Yeah, I know. Well, you guys are actually, I agree. I mean, I think, and one thing too is with cars changing, literally, like driverless cars or something, or do actually get infrastructure going where we have light rail in the U.S. There might be more space for more trees and more planting and more paths and things, and I think that I do think something like at that base scale of neighborhood walks and parks matters, and this is a time I think might help us realize that too. The COVID time, because we all are. You try to go from a city, like from here on the East Coast, you try to go somewhere natural. It's horrendous. There's so many people everywhere. It's like, what is this? And so the little local parks are that much more critical. The little vacant lots are that much more critical. You're like, oh, thank God, there's this weeds. I mean, it's noticeable. I think, and I hope it's noticeable to not just those of us who are like, sensitive. I hope more people are experiencing that. And it might shift the weight a little bit towards what we're talking about. But you guys also, with your tree lab, actually, and the second part of the exercise is like, if you were going to put signage, how would you do it? What would it look like? And it's such a challenge. I think we should, just make a pass at it, and everybody will learn from everybody. I think there are like, you could probably put like 20 iterations in front of me, and we could discuss all those, and we might be getting close to something interesting idea. I just think it's quite challenging. So it's fun though, and there's some other ideas. Let's see, I think hopefully it's in this, but there are, there's also a student actually had seen in Somerville, I think it was the Watershed group was putting signs on the street trees about how much work it was doing, and then this idea of crowd documentation. There are some specific platforms like iNature, where, and there are a couple others, but some specific platforms where people are focused on environmental metrics, and you could, it could be some sort of crowdsourced data thing too. That could be interesting. And so the idea would be that you would propose, wouldn't be obviously to make the whole thing, but maybe just outline it, kind of schematic sketch the concept of how something like that could work, how the relationships might work, or who the interested players are, who the interested players might be. So this, again, is a tool, this diagram's a tool for thinking about a question at the level of focus or observation that you're making, and understanding the mechanisms at play in making that situation the way it is, and then considering what the implications of that observation are at a larger scale. What are the limiting factors, like what are kind of its extent, and what kind of impact does it have on this sort of that next stage out. Again, skim your reading, find it, think about it, and then one of your discussion questions is going to be on this diagram, where we talked last week as well about how, depending on the phenomenon that you're trying to understand or that you're looking at, it changes both in spatial scale and in temporal scale and time. So if, for example, if one of the phenomenon you're trying to understand has to do with an environmental disturbance regime, like in this first block, and you're looking at, like a disturbance event, such as, we'll talk a little bit more later about disturbance or events and regimes, but an event is just one-off scenario, and a regime is something that happens regularly, like every year there's a flood or that kind of situation. But with an event like a wildfire or a clear cut or an urban fire or an earthquake or whatever, this is a disturbance event. It's takes up a certain amount of space, but not a lot of time. It's a short amount of time comparatively to fire regimes or climatic changes or soil development or glacial climatic cycles, plate tectonics. Talking about mega time and mega space, right? And then the same is true, though, if you're thinking about just biotic responses, like this middle section. So, and, talking about productivity and competition, secondary succession, which is, there's a primary successional sequence. There'll be some kind of disturbance, some blowdown with some trees. And then, there's a secondary process of succession. Species migration, ecosystem change, those things are taking more and more time and space. What's interesting actually about species migration is that's going to start taking less time, right? Because change in the environment is going to be forcing it to happen faster. It's going to be an interesting problem. But so in the discussion question, you're asked to make an observation or think of an issue, a topic in one of your projects, and try to place it on this, place that phenomena on this chart, and think about what it means in terms of space and time. Again, you'll find it in the reading, and you can skim to that part and read specifically about it. And then let's see. This is, I guess, just, in terms of finding balance within an ecosystem, like amongst the vegetation health or large herbivores like the moose, nutrient cycling in general, what is the point? Just, I guess, in order to find the stable state for some of those different categories, you need to have an understanding of that. This, enough scale where you start to see a spatial unevenness of that. There has to be spatial heterogeneity in order to find a balance. And a lot of these large, like vegetation, large herbivore populations or nutrient cycling. The little orange in the corner is there to remind me about the researcher, this guy Huffaker was his name, and he first was coming up with this idea about heterogeneity or unevenness resulting in equal and even population surviving, because he was using an orange. We had a little mite, and there was a fruit fly that was eating the mite. And when all the oranges were together in one spot, the fruit fly would get all of the mites. But when he moved the oranges apart, the fruit flies did not get all the mites. They got some of it, but not the entire population of mites. So really, that's this idea around spatial heterogeneity and the patterns that those created, helping balance populations. So there's more about that in the reading as well. This is I think that last week we had the image of the moose, but we didn't have this chart, and it's just talking about over time. This is actually from, I think it's from, Presque Isle, or one of the islands way up in Marquette from where I am from, but you can see that the moose population starts to go up and the wolf population skyrockets. They're just like, wow, food, and so thus the moose population is declining. There's a really precipitous drop in the wolves, and it goes back. I wonder about that in the 70s to the 90s. That's probably human. Humans hunting the wolves.
Maturity.
How long do they take to reach maturity? I'm not sure how old they live, actually. That's a good question.
Because it kind of looks like a correlation between those two drops, but they're 20 years apart. So I don't know if there's any actual correlation there.
Yeah, I don't think they live 20 years. They might. I would guess they have more of like a 10-year cycle, but I'm not sure, really. I really don't know. I know that, like in northern Michigan, they've had other issues with the moose populations. And let's see, that might have been 89. That might be around that really big drop in the moose. So the climbing in the moose is probably related to, obviously the drop in wolves is humans. We're like too scared of wolves. And then that big drop in the moose could have been this brainworm. I know there was a brainworm that deer got and carried all over the place and were fine, but all the moose were dropping dead from it, to the point where they were trying to, we saw this video of this from up in Canada. They had moose hanging from a helicopter, the helicopter like swinging, and they were trying to helicopter the moose back. I don't know, it seems like it would just get the same. You saw that moose flying? Oh, that's funny. It's a good one. You guys gotta Google that. But it seems like it would just get the brainworm as well. But I guess, though, that might have been what that big drop was. It's...
Wondering if any of that has to do with ticks. I remember hearing ticks weaken the moose, and then in the winter it kills the moose because they don't have enough food in their body.
Yeah, I didn't realize. There's so many ticks are weird. They have multiple viruses. I didn't realize humans. It's not just Lyme's disease. There's something with a bee, Balceris or something. You can also get. I was like, they've been quite significant this year. I felt too. It seems. So this diagram, you guys will get sick of me talking about it, but again, for yourselves, look up this idea of these central four ecological services, and just really, what does that mean? Supporting, regulating, provisioning, and cultural. Because again, as I said before, these outside rings are they don't mean anything specific. I think they're like the beginning of a real diagram. This is like the beginning of a diagram that could end up talking about something, but it isn't really at this point. So but they are examples of things. What are some examples of regulating eco services, and some examples of like water quality and climate modulation. Minimizing natural disaster impacts and recovery times. So, and that's true all the way around. They're just some examples of each category, but you do want to just try to look up at the definitions for each of those and try to understand, like, okay, what does that mean? And then there are a lot of others that and any time you're making any kind of observation in nature or almost any situation, probably you could start articulating what kind of services are going on there. Often so many more, again, be like, talking about this you'll be using quite a bit, I hope, too, for your thinking through your tree diagrams and talking about all the services involved there. So again, spatial heterogeneity, I think everyone's getting that pretty well, but again, that it's this uneven pattern, and it's true both in nature and in the urban context, and it's actually one of the things that makes is a large part of the argument for saying that the urban is also an ecology. You have this, and it's, it also very responsive to biotic processes and all natural processes as well. So the other, other than the mosaic, which is mostly what we're going to be dealing with in terms of spatial heterogeneity, the other concept is this idea of a gradient. So there's, the mosaic and the gradient, but gradients are much more rare. This image, I'm not even sure it's like what it is, like just a pixelated image at this point, but I think one of the best examples of a gradient and the unevenness and heterogeneity in a gradient like that is going into the ocean, the depth in the ocean. There's kind of an even change. Another example is, I think, going from upland to coastal, upland to water, like that kind of gradient change from higher ground to the water is kind of an even shift in the kind of what happens with the plants and things. And there are other situations you see gradients, and probably at scale you see them, but it's just much more rare. I just wanted to mention it because it's going to be the other way of describing spatial heterogeneity. So there's a mosaic and a gradient. Okay?
Is that flat?
What? What was that?
Is that flat? Did you already say that?
Flat?
In the field.
I think it's a field, yeah. Is it
black?
Maybe.
Or doesn't matter.
It's gotten so pixelated. I'm like, what was it? It could have been flax, yeah.
Does that blue color seems
interesting.
distinct. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I probably should have a better image for a gradient, but I think you get the idea, I hope, yeah. So again, the four mechanisms, so these are the four pieces that would go in that diagram. If you're talking about your middle area of focus, is that mosaic pattern, the heterogeneity of whatever you're looking at, the unevenness, that's what you're looking at. You're trying to understand why. You got to remember the four mechanisms causing that unevenness are the abiotic, the biotic, human activity, and disturbance. So you got those four things playing out into that mosaic pattern, and then the overall result of that spatial heterogeneity, maybe you say some kind of population stabilization, or balanced environment, or functioning ecosystem would be like an overarching result. But I definitely think it's an entertaining activity to just take a view like this and try to break down what's causing the form most. It's like, was that Fernanda, you were saying earlier about why does water go the way it goes? It's like, what is causing the river to be in that location? And so that would be like the abiotic conditions of the geography, right? What the shape of the land is doing. And what's causing those trees to be in that location and not in other locations? It's probably a combination of things, right? It's going to be disturbance, human activity, abiotic and biotic factors. All four things are going to be causing those trees to bunch up in that certain area. It's interesting to go through and try to make up. You're making up theories essentially. You're making guesses, making up stories about why that spatial heterogeneity, why that mosaic pattern is what it is. It's kind of fun, actually. And you can, and again, you make a theory, you're not saying it's truth, but you can test it or pursue it. Like if it's a design idea, you can pursue it both historically and going forward. What does that mean you get different results going forward if you think about the different factors at play.
And these patterns exist in built environments as well, right?
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
So this is this image. So from last week, look at that slide again about, it was I think on this image actually from last week, it outlines from Pickett's writing about why the city is also an ecology. But it goes through all the points about why the built is also functioning just like an ecology. But in this image is of a city. So absolutely, it's those same four mechanisms are causing the unevenness of a city. So roads in a city are going probably partly because of geography, right? The lowest point or on the ridge or whatever. They were just, Alec was describing Arlington that, they left the valleys open. And so there's all these greenways and things. There's a combination of factors there. It's people's decisions, what they were building, and the biotic conditions that they were. This is your site, right? So
So when we're doing site analysis, it would be useful to consider these patterns in the city, right?
Absolutely.
Normally we do landmarks, T-stops, circulation, and all those basic site analysis. But we never actually do something like this. Analyze the patterns.
I think you're right. I think it's a little bit different way of thinking about what we already do. Actually, I agree. And I think what happens is that you actually start analyzing further. So you're not like what you're doing, what you just said, you're like kind of mapping. Like I'm mapping this stuff out. Like there it is. Okay, there's that. But in the analysis part is saying, okay, what does that mean? What is its direction? What's its force? What does that imply on the site? What is its push? What does that do to impact this project? How does that impact this project? Or how does my project respond to it? That's the analysis part in my mind. That's the actual the real site analysis. It's kind of the assessment of the opinion, having the attitude after doing all the mapping. So understanding these things, if you add these thinking to that process, you'll have much more ability to have kind of an understanding of what's the push involved.
Cool.
Yeah, I think that'll help. I hope. Yeah, that's the goal.
So like just setting up like an example, like my site, it's at the north and waterfront. And geography. It's a basin. So we need to I need to think about how do I design something that it's in a basin, right? Because all the water's gonna end up there. And we have the waterfront, like we have water moving all the time, and then with sea level rise, like that water's gonna eventually get in the city,
Absolutely. I mean, you I think the water is going to be a huge one to consider for that site. Absolutely. And I think looking out at the watershed scale will be interesting. Although mainly you're going to be affected right on the north end by storm surge. That's mostly going to be that'll mostly be an issue. So but again, I probably told a different group. It feels like I just told. Good precedent for actually building for the first Florida flood is in Hamburg, Germany. That's a particular neighborhood in there, though. Hafen City, Haffen, in Hamburg. They built it literally planning on the thing to flood. It's really. I mean, that's smart. That's the way to be thinking, I think, in places like North End.
Can you write it in the chat right now?
I think you mentioned that last week.
Was it last? I did mention it here. Yeah.
Yeah, that was us. I also read about a park in somewhere in the Netherlands that is built over like a big water retention chamber that's underground, but the park is submerged a little bit from the street level, and during heavy rains or floods, like it fills up a little bit with water before it goes down, and it's like a water park area for like kids to play in, because they have like waterfalls and areas.
Yeah, you can do so many cool things with space temporarily that then has water moving through, and the Dutch have had to always do this cut, fill, balance, polder thing. I mean, they've always been living with water. Yeah. That sounds super cool. I think that I love those examples where it's like, it's going to flood and let's plan on it and recover quickly. That's what you're not talking about. That's resiliency versus sustainability, right? Resiliency is how quickly you can recover. And I definitely think that's kind of the approach to be taking in that area. I've been shocked by Fort Point. Like, why? Why are we pretending that this isn't real? But because in like the design opportunities, I think are awesome. They're fun. It's actually, you get some great architecture and great landscapes, but not in Boston's agenda, I'm afraid. Anyway, my opinion. So, okay, so now we're just going to run through patches, introduce patches, and there's 5 different ways that they originated. There's a lot more description in the reading in Foreman's stuff, and there's a lot more about trying to understand the forces at play and things and how you have to articulate a patch. So please do try to at least skim through all that, because I really want this to be not something like you see and you think you understand. Like here, this is an obvious example of a patch. The green tree clumps, right? But really, it's just an example of a relatively homogeneous area that's different from its surroundings, right? So you could, we could zoom in on that grass picture. Say,
I'm sorry. Why is the other part says forest? What's the difference? I mean, I know what's the difference, but like, why is they both in the same picture?
It says forest patch on each of them. They just had to split up the words.
Okay.
By that as well. They all say forest patch.
Forest patch.
Or patch forest, whichever.
Oh yeah, and it's not each of the slides. It shouldn't just say forest patch, because so like this is a patch of dirt, patch of grass. Literally, it's just when an area is similar. The same you could say for the city. A patch of sidewalk, a patch of high rises, a patch of industrial area. It depends on the scale. You can zoom in and out and talk about patches, and that is again you have to articulate what's the thing you're looking at there. And again, thinking about succession in landscape is the thing that gives landscape directionality, that give a plant community directionality. There are a lot of different forces at play in giving a patch of, say, high-rise development directionality. But there are forces at play giving that patch directionality, right? So that you can think and break down urban pattern the same way this is talking about nature pattern. Not the same, but very similar ways, right? So yes, in the reading, we're focusing on Foreman's book about the nature land mosaics, but I don't know actually that I assigned much from the other book, the urban ecology, science of cities, but it might be worth, I would definitely recommend buying that for all of you just out of interest, because it's going to take more of what we're talking about and applying it to the urban. And for me too, it's where it gets most exciting. But I think in order to isolate these concepts and for you to understand them on their own first, it's easier to start with it kind of focusing more on the natural, or I don't know. It's maybe more what we expect, I guess. I think of ecology on it. Maybe have to make some changes, eh? But so anyway, so you'll find right on page 43 this definition from Foreman of the patch. That should be in your reading this week, in the section that was given. But again, this is just the way, like you said, it says patch forest, exactly. It's just the way they describe that. It's not even a forest, really, right? I could call it patch canopy, patch of large canopy trees. Maybe more accurate, but that naming is important. Just the idea that it's an area that differs from its surroundings. And there are really, this is, the idea here is that you would actually draw the 5 different causes and origins. We're going to talk about each of these 5 causes and origins, and the goal will be that you have a diagram for the establishment of a patch for both a natural condition and an urban condition. So these are, the kind of causes and origins. So the patch dynamic portion, taking some of these ideas and translating them to the urban, it gets pretty interesting. So there's more in the reading about the directionality idea, but going through each of these. So as we're talking about them, try to come up with a little stick diagram, how you would just talk about the forces at play, some lines with something pushing it over. So for here, an example, a disturbance, this is wind throw. A big wind came through and knocked over that area of trees. It could be fire, it could be something, it could be a flood, it could be a fire in an urban context, it could be a hurricane in an urban context. But that, a patch is created by the disturbance coming in and hitting it. So see if you can diagram that. The idea of a remnant patch, again, this is just one example of it. There, you could have a remnant patch of anything, but in this scenario, it's a remnant patch of trees. It's likely actually a wetland. It's probably lower than its area, but obviously everything else has been cleared and developed, either farming or suburbs.
It looks like it might be something for flooding.
It could be. It could be stormwater management.
Is that?
It looks wetter there too. It looks lower, but I'm not sure if it is. But it's definitely a remnant of some of what had been previously there before it was cleared, based on the size, judging from the age and size of some of those trees in the stand. And then an environmental patch, this is not the best image. I had trouble finding a good image, but it's you're going to have to deal with what my thought of this image is. And the idea is that the idea of an environmental patch, it's the flowers, but it's that it's caused by some kind of environmental condition creating a unique little opening, right? So here, this idea is there's a patch, some kind of ledge on a mountain, and this has allowed more soil to establish. There's been some disturbance, so it's open, and this opening allowed for this patch of little field flowers. It's lovely.
Aren't a lot of meadows like in within forested areas caused by like a higher water table?
Often, absolutely, yeah. So that's a perfect example would be a high water table that creating an environment that allows for a patch, this other kind of condition. Yeah, exactly. And then a regenerated patch is just what it sounds like. It's coming up again, and I'm in an urban condition. Imagine urban renewal or rebuilt area or
So
planted area.
So when you talk about regenerating, what kind of plants do you place? Do you place like native plants or I'm always wondering about this. Like you're originating the whole ecosystem, right? So you need the plants that belong in this area or in this specific area.
Yeah, I mean, it depends on the situation. Like in an urban context, you'll have like the soils will be so degraded that it can depend on soil first. Maybe it's kind of like how much you can do with your soil. That could determine where you start with the plants. But in a natural condition like this, succession it'll start with first little mosses and little tiny species, and the next little shrub, specific species, depending on where you are on the globe. So like for here, like where we are in temperate, a lot of times the first, I don't know what some of the first ground covers are. There's some moss, say sphagnum moss or something. There's some little tiny ground cover things, and then birch trees. Birch are really early successional species, and the white pine often follow. They need a lot of light. And then here we often get up to like hemlock or beech. In between you have maples and oaks. But this sequencing of trees, like birch trees in the beginning, they only live 20 to 30 years on their own. They just die. They're like, so they senesce. Like that architect's, like Santos's application to senescence of material in a building. But a birch tree will just senesce on its own at like 20 to 30 years. So they die off and it lets the next thing come. So, but if they're then in that mature forest, there's a blowout. You might start again with the birch and the white pine. So that's how you get that patchiness and the unevenness in the whole forest structure. It's like those patch dynamics, the movement of the species and the formation of the patches, the dying off, the growing, that they're not the same age. There's a couple more. We'll talk more about that process of things reestablishing. But I think a lot of how you do it like that, like as a native species or not, really depends on the existing situation and what the goals are. Like where you're trying to get to. Kind of like what we were talking about with a restoration ecologist versus a landscape architect. You might have some different goals depending on what the project is. But there's a lot of places that you overlap. So.
Okay.
So an introduced species is one that wasn't there before. Here I'm using marijuana because it's interesting on so many levels, right? There's legal levels, there's all the social aspects, and it's just it's changing so many aspects of society. Well, patch it is an introduced material in so many ways, but obviously introduced in this context as well. So that's the idea of the different causes or origins of patch, and that's that there is a directionality to every patch, whether it's urban or natural, and the forces at play are going to be different based on that situation that you're observing. But those and the five basic origins are these kind of these are kind of the ways that patches are often established. So try to give yourself diagrams, both in a natural context and urban context, and see if you can just help solidify what this kind of things these mean. And then one of the other, I think, issues when you talk about trying to find balance or restore a landscape and especially in terms of ecological functioning, it's what's the best strategy to do so, which is ecologically better, which is going to provide the most ecological services. So there's a pretty long discussion in the Foreman reading about this. I'm pretty sure it's in this, what you have in the PDF you guys have this week, but the basic idea is it loss or sloss? Large or small, more patches more important, or are several large or several small? Does it matter? Like what kind of benefits do you get? And it goes through all these different services that large patches offer versus small. But what it comes down to is that you really can't get all the benefits that large patches provide with small. So you really need, there have to be large patches for some of like the supporting, the major, really, big, major provisioning and supporting ecological services happen in large patches. And let's see. Okay, this one of the other. There's some species and things really dependent on the kind of habitat provided in larger patches. So, but it's interesting to think about because we have to. You're always trying to regenerate and reestablish a functioning ecology, and it has to be systemic because we're not going to just reforest all of, say, the the globe or the like we were seeing in the United States. But could you start making more of a network and more of a system that could provide more of these ecological services, especially when you think about climate change and like migration of species and things. It's really kind of complex, but moving to corridors. A corridor is essentially an elongated patch. It's also, so literally it's just, something long and linear it's different than its surroundings. It does have a couple other characteristics that are different than patches. One of which is obviously, it tends to be, its width is fairly limiting, and there will be some kind of central condition, like the river or the road, and then there's a really steep gradient of change to the edges of it. So meaning like you go from road and highway to some infrastructure, little shrubs and trees, a little tiny dusty walkway to something else, to urban fabric, right? So the structural attributes of a corridor are different from a patch in that they, tend to have this strong difference from the center to the edge. And the center usually includes some kind of significant feature. And then there's because of that quick change, there's a lot of variation in terms of like the vertical structure of a corridor as well. So, and 5 of the major, this is not so much about the origins, because a lot of the origins will actually be similar for patches, right? The patch dynamic, we were talking about our origins of a lot of corridors as well, or, often it's that central piece. But they have particular functions, different than patches. In terms of habitat, they tend to be habitat for generalist species, edge species that can move along, and they don't need they don't need a huge territory to hunt. They like to hunt from an edge where they're looking, like a lot of birds of prey, are generalists. Invasive and exotic species tend to like corridors because they can handle the disruption. There's often constant disturbance, and they can, invasives often don't have a problem with that. So a lot of times the habitat is very disturbance heavy, so species there are more tolerant. It's definitely a conduit, obviously, moving water or people, but also goods, services, pollution, soil, all kinds of things, seed sources, like energy. So many things are moving through corridors. This idea of how does a corridor function as a conduit? There are a lot of aspects to it that get more and more kind of interesting, and I guess generative in terms of imagining the forces at play in the spatial implications of these. Like the idea of the countercurrent principle is one that in the body, and I honestly don't understand that well, but in blood, the idea is like when there's things moving in opposite directions in your body, there's more exchange that happens. You definitely can see how that could be true, like say in a shopping scenario, you have people moving in opposite directions, more exchange can happen just by exposure, or say, communicating with people, how you're passing on the sidewalk. If everybody on the sidewalk is going the same direction versus going in opposite directions, you're going to make a lot more eye contact, or smile at people or whatever if you're going in opposite directions than if you're all moving in the same. So all I think that the opportunity to explore how forces work within the conduit could be quite interesting. They sort of spin off and flow along a movement corridor as well. It's interesting. A filter works as a filter. So a lot of times you see this in urban condition, it's highway running through a neighborhood. On one side, you'll have one type of neighborhood. On the other side of the highway, it's very different. So it's often separating two very different conditions, and also can, filter, say, if you're moving down a slope and trying to cross some kind of a corridor that ends up collecting a lot of, say, runoff or debris or whatever that would be running off the slope, it's going to get filtered because it's, got kind of a different condition that it's having to pass through with that corridor on the end. And as a source, it's often moving things out into the matrix, and it's accumulating things from the context in. So the matrix is just I think it's that next. It's the matrix. Of course, there's that. But the matrix is the idea of whatever it's embedded, whatever the patches and corridors are embedded in as this network. So it's just like almost like the movie It Is Everything. But so determining the matrix is based on this idea though of area, connectivity, and then dominance of function. Did I have a? Yeah. So I want to always be able to draw here. Can I draw right here? Annotate. Oh, now the messages pop up. Okay. I was trying to put half in the city in here for you guys before, but it's actually there from before. Oh, good. Okay. All right. So area. Well, let me draw here. Yes. Okay. So imagine this place. You're trying to determine which is the dominant matrix. Is it the white or is it the black? I know it's not very solid black, but imagine that's solid black and it's white because that's taking up the most area, right? That's pretty easy. And that usually is enough. Within a study area, you can usually tell what the matrix is just based on what's taking up the most space. So like if you're trying to understand a lot of times in urban context, the matrix is urban fabric. That would be, if you're trying to understand, it'll change at a different scale. We might say, like you could be at a scale where you're talking about a suburban development is the matrix versus rural, right? It's like kind of what's the density, what's taking up more area, built or not built. So the next piece, if it seems too even, it's too close, the next thing to consider would be connectivity. So not often, you're often having to look, depending on how zoomed in you are, you might have to zoom out and zoom in, and either you can tell by zooming out and zooming in about area, or through connectivity, you'll see it looks about like the same area, but the white stuff is actually spreading and moving out. Like you zoom and it ends up that the fact that the white is more connected, even though the areas, they're both white actually, sorry. So imagine these things are all colored in. But because the white is more connected, it would be considered the matrix in that context. And then you almost never have to get to the scenario of control over, but that would be as if the slate were wiped clean, what would be have the greatest influence? Who would be the most dominant species or force, at play in establishing what is reestablishing the site? It's a strange one, and it doesn't usually come to that, but it could.
So
maybe in a flood scenario.
All these generally have equal weight, or is it kind of taken as a case-by-case basis? Like,
it's usually step by step. Like usually first, like we try and understand what's the matrix of this study area. You'll be able to understand first by area, probably. If not, then can you tell by connectivity? And if you still can't tell, then you can look at control over dynamics. And you just you can usually. It's kind of, I guess it's kind of subjective, but depending on the study, it gets more and more specific. Yeah. Like you could be, so what you're trying to, it can be quite clear. But in the reading to it, should talk more about this matrix idea and give you a bit more background on how to think about it. We'll be trying to understand it. We'll do like an analog landscape analysis of a site, and we'll understand it in that context. So you guys will have experience of like applying this thinking to a site. All right, so clear. Hold on, yeah. Okay. Okay, so still in establishing this, this mosaic pattern within whatever matrix you have, the matrix is often, it's going to be based, it'll be, your articulation of it is going to be based on the physical, on the abiotic, the biotic, and the human impact of that site. I mean, that is going to basically be, those factors will be part of your matrix description, but they are also the factors at play in terms of establishing that pattern of patches and corridors. So you can start isolating those spatial results and start trying to articulate what are the forces, which of these 4 mechanisms were the most dominant to cause those. And that's going to change, obviously, depending on what you're looking at and what scale you're looking at it. But it's really interesting, especially when you, so for example, say you're looking at water health and you're trying to look at, a small site area versus when you zoom out and look at the much larger system, it really changes your, understanding of what factors are at play, what are the mechanisms causing that water health. So it's definitely interesting to zoom in and out on a single concept, to think about that way. Okay, so do I have some other... I was hoping for maybe some more illustrative succession diagrams. These are kind of dry. But let's see. All right, so in a primary succession, the main ideas to talk about here, though, is in a primary succession situation. There are these, a pioneer stage. The seral stage is referred to like, are you on dry ground, like a hydrosere, that's wet ground. There's a way of saying rock. I mean, seral is it's a type of land material. And basically, within, say, a temperate forest, if you're in a wetland or you're up on a mountain, even though you're in a temperate forest, there's going to be, because of that seral place, you're going to have a certain community established. If that makes sense, I hope. But within this primary succession sequence, it's a pioneer stage, there's a middle, there's subclimax, and then a climax stage. And historically, that was what was understood about succession. It was like, we get to our beech hemlock forest and that's it. But that changed. I mean, that thinking has changed at least probably 20 plus years ago. Not that long ago, really, but fairly recently. To an understanding of, nothing is set. It's constant flux. And this idea of secondary succession, where there was some kind of disturbance, and you push back into one of the early seral stages of primary succession. And then, so there are different factors there in secondary succession, more based on the biotic community that you're dealing with, more about how much light is allowed in through the leaves, what's been growing there already, so what's in the soil, how much water and nutrients the different species take, and how much nitrogen is available to different species. Plants just become, the biotic species they're sensitive to that, so you'll see them kind of occurring based on those conditions. And then there's an interesting scenario where you have these chronic disturbances of plant adaptation. You can actually, that's probably one of the places where you can see evolution most quickly in plant species, where there's a chronic disturbance and you actually can watch how the plant species will adapt and establish themselves as the most successful in that context. It's quite interesting. So this idea was just that there are two ways, like some aspects of succession come from within the plant community itself, some come from outside. I mean, is it something that, there's acid rain happening, or, they're responding to climate change, or there was a fire or something, or clear cut, or is it coming from, the birch tree is just naturally dying? It's autogenic, it's internal to the plant community, versus allogenic, which is coming from outside. Just again to think about, in terms of understanding the directionality of a patch, think about some of the pushes coming from inside, some coming from outside, right? Oh, good. This slide does describe all the different seres, different kinds of plant communities within a single, say, temperate forest. You're going to have different types of plant communities depending on what the context is. On just, that this their location, their biotic response to their abiotic condition is what you're seeing in the unevenness of plant communities and in plant patterns. But I like, so many of you bringing up the food issue with from the drawdown as the strategies, and it being number one. But I think when you start thinking about it, it's like so much food is a separate thing as energy moving through the system. This one is just breaking down, primary production, photosynthesis, and herbivores, decomposers, just a basic ecosystem situation. You could start adding in here, humans in the built, modifying this diagram to talk about all the different ways these sort of base flows are disrupted and kind of reintegrated and things. But it's interesting, I think, when you start shifting into thinking of just more of a materiality and an energy flow idea about how you might close some of the loops. And a lot of this thinking, the directionality of patches and corridors and succession and the idea of energy flowing through an ecosystem. This is also, I think, what's pushing the way it's the scale change to more of a landscape scale. These diagrams are just an example about movement and forces this is just from a specific source, some, people drawing some diagrams, but it's just to encourage all of you to try to develop more ways to talk about the different forces at play. That's what our challenge is, right? Is to take these concepts and translate them into a graphic that people can understand and that it's meaningful to the concept that we're trying to illustrate. So, these are, I think, are oversimplistic or not exhaustive by any means in terms of what you might be trying to talk about when you're talking about all the different forces at play, internal and external. But again, just some examples to encourage you to explore with that. Okay, so this is about your first project. I think actually I want to talk about your labs first, and